Embret Lunde pressed fresh hay between the logs of his cabin while his neighbors watched from across the frozen field, shaking their heads at the madness. By spring, every one of them would be asking how he did it. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The fire in the Lunde cabin burned hot enough to make the iron stove glow red, but 3-year-old Gunhild's lips had turned blue anyway. Embret Lunde held his daughter wrapped in every blanket the family owned, while Ragnhild fed split oak into the flames as fast as the stove could take it. Outside, the January wind of 1868 screamed across the Minnesota prairie, driving temperatures down to 40 degrees below zero. Inside the cabin, frost formed on the interior walls despite the roaring fire. The temperature near the stove might have reached 60 degrees. 10 feet away, it dropped below freezing. Gunhild had been coughing for 2 days. The cold had settled into her chest, and in a cabin that couldn't hold heat, there was no way to warm her enough to fight it. Embret had wrapped her in wool and fur. He had held her close to his body, sharing what warmth he had. Ragnhild had boiled water to create steam, trying to ease the child's breathing. None of it mattered. Around 3 in the morning, Gunhild stopped coughing. Her small body went still in Embret's arms. He knew she was gone before Ragnhild turned from the stove and saw his face. They sat together in silence while the fire consumed wood and produced heat that escaped through gaps in the log walls almost as fast as it was generated. The cabin had been built the previous spring, using standard frontier construction. Logs notched at corners, chinked with mud and moss, a single-wall structure identical to every other Norwegian settler's home in the township. It had seemed adequate during mild weather. It had proven deadly when real cold arrived. 7-year-old Tarjei slept in the loft, somehow warm enough under piled furs. But Gunhild had been smaller, more vulnerable, and the cabin's inability to maintain temperature had killed her as surely as any disease. Embret understood this with absolute clarity as he held his daughter's body. The cold had won because the cabin couldn't fight it. The walls leaked heat, the gaps between logs allowed wind to penetrate. The mud chinking had dried and cracked during autumn, creating channels for cold air to enter. They had burned an enormous amount of firewood trying to compensate, but you couldn't heat the outdoors, and a cabin this poorly insulated was barely different from outdoors. When dawn came gray and brutal, Embret carried Gunhild outside. The ground was frozen solid. They would have to keep her body in the unheated shed until spring thaw allowed for burial. Ragnhild followed him, silent, her face empty of everything except grief. Embret placed his daughter in the shed next to frozen tools and stored equipment, then stood looking at the cabin he had built. It looked exactly like every other cabin in the settlement. Solid logs, properly notched, adequately chinked by the standards everyone accepted. But adequate wasn't enough when temperatures dropped this low. Adequate killed children. He walked to the barn where their 2 cows and 4 sheep were kept. Inside, the temperature was noticeably warmer than outside, warmer even than the cabin had been away from the stove. The animals' body heat helped, but something else was different. The barn walls were packed with loose hay for winter bedding and insulation. The hay created a thick barrier between the log walls and the interior space. Embret stood in the barn, feeling warmth that his cabin couldn't provide, and something shifted in his thinking. Spring came late to Minnesota in 1869. Snow lingered into April, and the ground remained frozen until May. Embret buried Gunhild on a hillside, overlooking their claim when the earth finally thawed enough to dig. Ragnhild stood beside him with Tarjei, and they marked the grave with stones carried from the creek bed. The settlement's other Norwegian families attended, offering quiet condolences in their shared language. Everyone understood the winter's toll. 3 other children had died in the township during the cold months, along with 2 elderly settlers. Harsh winters were expected. Death was part of frontier life. Most families grieved and moved forward. Embret couldn't let it go. He spent the spring obsessively measuring temperatures. He built simple thermometers using sealed glass tubes partially filled with colored alcohol, marking calibrations based on the freezing and boiling points of water. The devices were crude but functional. He placed them in different locations around his property and recorded readings multiple times daily. Inside the cabin near the stove, away from the stove, in the loft near the door, outside in shade and sun, inside the barn at various locations. The pattern that emerged confirmed what he had noticed the night Gunhild died. The barn maintained significantly warmer temperatures than the cabin, even accounting for animal body heat. On cold nights, the barn interior stayed 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside air. The cabin, despite having a fire, barely managed 10 degrees of difference away from the immediate stove area. The variable was insulation. Embret examined the barn's construction carefully. The walls were single log thickness, same as the cabin. The chinking was actually inferior to the cabin's, with larger gaps and less careful application. But the entire interior was lined with loose hay stacked 3 feet deep against the walls for winter livestock bedding. The hay created a thick barrier of dead air space between the cold exterior logs and the interior where the animals lived. Dead air was the key. Embret had learned basic physics from his father, who had been a carpenter in Norway. Air itself conducted heat poorly. The problem was that air moved, creating convection currents that transferred heat away from warm areas to cold areas. But if you trapped air in small spaces where it couldn't circulate, it became an effective insulator. Hay, with its hollow stems and tangled structure, created millions of tiny air pockets. Each pocket trapped still air that couldn't convect heat away. The cumulative effect was dramatic. Other materials worked similarly. Wool fabric trapped air between fibers. Fur trapped air between hairs. Snow, paradoxically, was an excellent insulator because it trapped air between ice crystals. But hay had advantages over these other materials. It was abundant on the prairie. It could be harvested and processed with tools settlers already owned. It was thick enough to provide substantial insulation in a single application. The question was whether it could be incorporated into cabin wall construction in a way that would remain stable and effective. Embret spent his evenings sketching designs while Ragnhild mended clothing and Tarjei slept. Standard cabin construction used logs fitted tightly together. His innovation would require spacing them apart to create room for insulation between them. The technical challenges were significant, but the physics were sound. In late May of 1869, Embret announced his intention to build a new cabin using hay as wall insulation. He made the announcement at a community gathering after Sunday services when most of the settlement's Norwegian families were present. The reaction was immediate skepticism. Siver Bjornstad, whose farm adjoined Embret's property, laughed outright. Hay was livestock feed, not building material. Packing it into walls was insane. It would rot within a season. The moisture from cooking, breathing, and daily living would saturate the hay, creating perfect conditions for decay. By the following spring, Embret's walls would be composting from the inside. Gulbrand Ness, the settlement's most experienced carpenter, raised practical objections. Hay was flammable. Building walls from it was asking for a fire that would consume the entire structure. A single spark from the stove could ignite insulation and turn the cabin into a death trap faster than occupants could escape. Beyond the fire risk, hay would attract rodents. Mice and rats would nest in the walls, creating infestations impossible to eliminate. The cabin would become uninhabitable. Reverend Anfinn Kilde, who led the small congregation, asked why Embret would waste valuable livestock feed on construction. Hay took labor to harvest and store. Using it for building meant less feed available for animals. The economics made no sense. Animals needed hay to survive winter. Walls needed chinking, which could be gathered from the land at no cost. Trading essential animal feed for experimental wall material was poor stewardship. Embret listened to all objections without arguing. He explained simply that his current cabin had failed to protect his daughter. He had observed that hay-insulated spaces stayed warmer. He intended to test whether hay could be incorporated into wall construction effectively. If it worked, his family would be safer next winter. If it failed, he would rebuild using conventional methods. The risk was his to take. Ragnhild spoke up quietly, supporting her husband. She had also noticed the barn's warmth. If there was any chance a new cabin could prevent another death like Gunhild's, the attempt was worthwhile. Her support mattered. In the Norwegian community, wives' opinions carried weight in family decisions. Tarjei, standing beside his mother, nodded agreement, though he barely understood the technical discussion. Jacob Pritchard, an American merchant who traded with the Norwegian settlement, had attended the gathering out of curiosity. He asked practical questions about Embret's design. How would the hay be protected from weather? How would it be held in place? What would prevent settling and compression over time? Embret admitted he didn't have complete answers yet. He was still developing the construction method. Pritchard seemed intrigued rather than dismissive, which set him apart from the Norwegian settlers. The gathering ended with most families convinced Embret was making a mistake driven by grief rather than reason. Syver told others privately that they would be rebuilding Embret's cabin using proper methods within 2 years. Gulbrand predicted fire or rot would force reconstruction by the following spring, but no one tried to stop him. Late summer of 1869 brought the crucial decision of when to harvest hay for the construction project. Embret had researched hay harvest timing by talking to every farmer in the settlement and observing prairie grass growth patterns throughout the season. Most settlers cut hay in early July, when grass was still partially green and nutritionally rich for livestock. This early season hay had higher protein content and was preferred for feeding animals through winter. But Embret recognized that early hay retained significant moisture even after drying. The green plant matter would continue decomposing slowly in storage, generating heat and breaking down structure. For livestock feed, this was acceptable or even beneficial. For building insulation that needed to remain stable for years, it was disastrous. He waited until late August, watching the prairie grass mature fully. The seed heads dried to golden brown. The stems turned from green to tan. Other settlers had already completed their hay harvest weeks earlier and were preparing fields for fall. They thought Embret was missing the harvest window entirely. Syver commented loudly that Embret's livestock would starve because he was too obsessed with his crazy building project to cut hay on time. But Embret was selecting for specific characteristics. He wanted grass that had completed its growth cycle entirely. The plant sugars had converted to cellulose. The moisture content had dropped naturally through standing in the field. The stems had become hollow and dry, maximizing the air-trapping properties he needed for insulation. He rejected any grass that showed green color or flexibility. He was harvesting not for nutrition, but for structural stability and insulation value. The actual cutting took place over 4 days in early September. Embret used a scythe to cut selected areas of prairie grass, choosing patches where growth was uniform and seed heads were fully mature. He avoided low areas where grass might have retained excess moisture. He avoided areas damaged by early frost, which could compromise stem integrity. Ragnhild and Tarjei helped rake the cut grass into long windrows for drying. The weather cooperated with clear skies and low humidity. The cut grass dried in the field for 1 week, turned twice to ensure even drying. When Embret finally gathered it, the hay was crisp and rustled like paper when handled. Moisture content was minimal. He hauled it to a covered area he had built specifically for storage, keeping it off the ground and protected from rain. The storage structure was simple, just a raised platform with a sloped roof, but it kept the hay dry during the 6-week curing period Embret insisted on. Most settlers used hay within days or weeks of harvest. Embret waited through September and into October, allowing the hay to reach equilibrium moisture with the dry autumn air. He tested samples by breaking stems. They should snap cleanly rather than bend. He checked for any musty smell that would indicate decomposition. The hay that passed his standards was bone dry, structurally intact and completely free of decay. Neighbors walking past his storage structure shook their heads at the waste. Embret began the treatment process in mid-October of 1869, working in a clearing near his barn where he could tend large fires safely. The process he had developed over weeks of experimentation required pine tar, rendered animal fat, and wood ash. Each component served a specific purpose in preserving hay for long-term structural use. Pine tar came from rendering pine wood in a covered pit, a technique Embret had learned in Norway where tar production was common. He dug a shallow pit, lined it with stones, and filled it with pine wood cut into small pieces. He covered the wood with sod, leaving small vents, then built a fire on top. The heat drove volatile compounds from the wood, which dripped down and collected in a clay vessel at the pit's bottom. The process took 3 days to produce 2 gallons of thick, dark tar that smelled strongly of pine resin. Animal fat came from rendering scraps saved throughout the year. Embret had collected fat from butchered chickens, the pig they had slaughtered in spring, and trimmings from deer he had hunted. He melted the fat slowly in an iron pot over low heat, straining out solid matter until he had clear rendered tallow. The tallow would mix with pine tar to create a solution thin enough to penetrate hay fibers while maintaining preservative properties. Wood ash came from their stove and fireplace. Embret had saved ash all year, knowing he would need it. He sifted it through cloth to remove charcoal chunks, keeping only fine powder. The ash was alkaline, which would discourage insect activity and inhibit fungal growth. Combined with tar and fat, it created a preservation system. The mixing ratios took experimentation to establish. Too much tar made the mixture stiff and difficult to apply. Too much fat made it greasy and ineffective. Embret settled on 3 parts tar to 1 part fat, heated together until they blended into a uniform dark liquid. He bundled hay into tight sheaves about 18 inches in diameter, binding them with twine. Each sheaf was dipped into the hot tar-fat mixture, rotated to ensure even coating, then withdrawn and allowed to drip. The coating didn't soak through the entire sheaf, just penetrated the outer few inches, creating a protective shell. While the coating was still tacky, Embret dusted the sheaf heavily with wood ash. The ash stuck to the tar coating, creating a gray-brown crust that dried hard within hours. Syver Bjornstad stopped by one afternoon and watched the process with undisguised contempt. Embret was coating perfectly good livestock feed with tar and ash, rendering it inedible and useless. The work was backbreaking and time-consuming. Each sheaf required careful handling. The tar mixture had to be kept hot over the fire. The ash application had to happen at precisely the right moment before the tar dried. Embret processed 20 sheaves per day, working from dawn to dusk. He needed approximately 200 sheaves for the cabin he planned. 10 days of intensive labor to prepare insulation material that conventional wisdom said would fail anyway. Ragnhild brought him meals in the clearing. Tarjei helped carry ash buckets and stack finished sheaves under cover to cure. The treated hay was stored off the ground on a raised platform, protected from rain, and left to cure for 2 weeks before use. Construction of the new cabin began in early November of 1869, later than conventional wisdom recommended. Most settlers completed building projects before autumn to allow structures to settle before winter. Embret was starting construction with winter approaching, which neighbors considered further proof of poor judgment. But he had specific reasons for the timing. The treated hay had finished curing. The ground was still workable before deep frost. He could complete the basic structure before heavy snow, then finish interior work during winter months. The foundation came first, something most frontier cabins lacked entirely. Embret dug a trench 18 inches deep around the cabin's perimeter, creating a rectangle 16 feet by 20 feet. He filled the trench with stones gathered from the creek, packing them tightly and leveling the top surface. The stone foundation would prevent ground moisture from wicking into the logs and provide a stable, level base that wouldn't settle or shift. The effort took 3 days of hard labor hauling stones, but it was essential. The wall construction departed radically from standard methods. Conventional cabins used logs notched at corners and stacked tightly together with minimal gaps. Embrett's design used two separate log walls with space between them. He set the first logs of the inner wall on the stone foundation, creating the cabin's interior perimeter. These logs were 12 inches in diameter, carefully selected for straightness. He notched them at corners using traditional saddle joints, but these inner walls would be hidden eventually. 3 feet outside the inner wall, he placed the outer wall logs, also 12 inches in diameter. The outer wall followed the same perimeter, but created a gap of 36 inches between inner and outer walls. This gap would hold the hay insulation. Gulbrand Ness stopped by during the first week to observe the strange construction. He pointed out that Embrett was building 2 cabins instead of 1, doubling his labor and material costs. The inner wall alone would be adequate shelter. Adding an outer wall made no sense. Embrett explained the principle patiently. The inner wall would be the actual cabin interior. The outer wall would protect insulation from weather. The gap between them would hold hay that would keep heat inside. Gulbrand shook his head, unconvinced. The engineering was unnecessarily complex. As the walls rose, Embrett installed temporary bracing between inner and outer walls to maintain consistent spacing. The bracing would be removed once hay was packed and the structure was stable. He worked alone most days, though Tarjei helped after school, and Ranghild assisted when household work allowed. Each log had to be lifted, positioned, and secured. The double wall system meant twice the normal work for each course of logs. By late November, both walls had reached 6 feet in height. The gap between them was clearly visible, an empty channel running around the entire cabin perimeter. The structure looked bizarre, like a cabin built around a void. Neighbors passing by stared at the construction with confusion and amusement. Siver joked that Embrett was building a cabin for ghosts to live in the walls. But the framework was solid, the spacing was consistent, and Embrett was ready to begin the crucial phase of packing insulation. The insulation installation began in early December of 1869, with both inner and outer walls complete to a height of 7 feet. Embrett had refined his packing methodology through small-scale tests, and he now applied it systematically to the actual cabin structure. The treated hay sheaves were heavy, each weighing approximately 30 pounds after tar coating and ash dusting. He positioned the first sheaves vertically in the gap between walls, standing them on end so the length of the sheaf ran from ground to top of the current wall height. Each sheaf fit tightly against the next, creating a continuous barrier around the cabin's perimeter. The vertical orientation was deliberate. If sheaves were laid horizontally, they might compress over time under their own weight, creating settling and gaps. Vertical placement distributed weight differently and maintained structural stability. Between each vertical course of sheaves, Embrett installed birch bark sheets as moisture barriers. He had harvested birch bark in autumn, selecting large pieces from dead trees where bark loosened naturally. The bark was flexible but waterproof, and he positioned sheets to overlap like roof shingles, with upper pieces covering lower pieces, so any moisture would drain downward and outward. The bark prevented moisture migration from the cabin interior into the hay insulation while allowing the structure to breathe. Every third layer of hay received a bark barrier, creating a pattern that repeated as the walls rose. The installation was meticulous. Embrett checked spacing constantly to ensure the 36-inch gap remained consistent. He adjusted sheaf placement to avoid gaps or compressed areas. He overlapped bark sheets by at least 6 inches to ensure complete moisture protection. Ranghild helped cut and fit birch bark pieces to the required sizes. Tarjei assisted by handing materials to his father as he worked. The process was slow. Embrett completed approximately 4 feet of wall circumference per day, working from dawn to dusk. The cabin's perimeter totaled 72 feet, meaning the complete installation would take roughly 18 days of sustained effort. Neighbors began gathering to watch as word spread about the strange construction method. A Norwegian cabin being stuffed with tar-covered hay was unusual enough to draw spectators. Siver brought Gulbrand and several other settlers to observe one afternoon. They stood outside the construction site, commenting loudly enough for Embret to hear. The hay would rot within the year. Moisture from cooking and breathing would saturate the insulation despite the bark barriers. The entire wall cavity would become a composting mass of decaying vegetation. The cabin would smell like a manure pile by spring. Reverend Anfinn Kild asked Embret directly why he believed moisture wouldn't destroy the hay. Embret explained his treatment process. The pine tar coating sealed hay surfaces against moisture penetration. The wood ash created an alkaline environment hostile to fungal growth. The birch bark barriers prevented moisture migration from interior to insulation space. The tar-fat mixture had penetrated the outer layers of each sheaf, creating a protective shell while leaving the interior hollow stems intact for air trapping. The system was designed specifically to address moisture concerns. Kild listened, but remained skeptical. Theory was different from reality. Winter would test whether Embret's elaborate preparations actually worked or simply delayed inevitable failure. By mid-December of 1869, the insulation installation was complete to the full wall height of 8 feet. The gap between inner and outer log walls contained a continuous barrier of treated hay sheaves, precisely packed and protected by birch bark moisture barriers at regular intervals. The total thickness of the insulation layer measured 36 inches, an unprecedented amount for frontier cabin construction. Standard cabins used perhaps 2 inches of mud and moss chinking between logs. Embret's design used 18 times that thickness in organic insulation material specifically selected and treated for thermal performance. The visual effect was striking. From outside, the cabin appeared massively overbuilt with double walls and unusual bulk. The outer walls extended far beyond what seemed necessary for a simple dwelling. Neighbors joked that Embret was building a fortress to protect against armies rather than cold. Embret used the construction process as a teaching opportunity for Target. During evening hours, with the day's installation work complete, he explained the physics principles that made the design effective. Heat moved through materials in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction was heat moving through solid matter. Wood conducted heat poorly, which was why logs provided some insulation, but wood still conducted heat far better than trapped air. Convection was heat moving through flowing air or liquid. Wind blowing against cabin walls carried heat away through convection. Interior air warmed by the stove rose and circulated, creating convection currents that moved heat toward cold surfaces where it escaped. Radiation was heat moving through space as invisible energy, like warmth felt from the sun or a fire. All 3 processes worked constantly to remove heat from a cabin's interior during winter. The hay insulation addressed all 3 heat transfer mechanisms simultaneously. The treated hay sheaves created millions of tiny air pockets within their tangled structure. Each hollow stem was a microscopic insulation chamber. Air trapped in these chambers couldn't circulate, eliminating convection heat loss. The air itself conducted heat poorly, reducing conduction through the wall assembly. The sheer thickness of the insulation layer meant heat had to travel 3 feet through poor conductors to escape, dramatically slowing the rate of heat loss. The birch bark barriers further reduced moisture-driven heat transfer, since water vapor moving through walls carried heat energy with it. Target listened intently, asking questions that showed he understood the basic concepts even at 7 years old. He grasped that the goal was keeping heat inside rather than generating more heat. A well-insulated cabin needed less firewood because heat couldn't escape easily. Jacob Pritchard visited in late December, genuinely interested in the construction rather than skeptical like most Norwegian settlers. He brought a notebook and sketched the wall assembly, noting dimensions and materials. Pritchard had seen various building techniques across the frontier, but Embret's approach was unique in its systematic application of insulation principles. He asked about cost comparison to standard construction. Embret calculated honestly. The double wall system required twice the logs of single wall cabins, The treated hay represented significant labor investment. The birch bark collection took additional time. Total material and labor cost was roughly 3 times a conventional cabin, but fuel savings over the cabin's lifetime would recover that investment within several years. The roof construction began in early January of 1870, with wall insulation complete and the structure ready for overhead protection. Embret extended his insulation strategy upward, creating a thermal barrier above the living space that would prevent heat loss through the ceiling and roof assembly. Most frontier cabins lost tremendous heat through poorly insulated roofs. Hot air rose naturally through convection, accumulating at the ceiling where it escaped through gaps in simple pole and bark roof construction. Embret designed his roof to trap that rising heat and return it to the living space. He started with substantial ridgepoles spanning the width of the cabin. These weren't simple branches, but carefully selected logs 8 inches in diameter, notched to sit securely on the top course of the inner wall logs. He spaced them only 12 inches apart, much closer than conventional construction, creating a robust framework capable of supporting significant weight. Across the ridgepoles, he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. The planks were cut from straight-grained pine, each one split to roughly 2 inches thick and 8 inches wide. He positioned them perpendicular to the ridgepoles, with edges touching, creating a complete floor above the cabin interior. This plank layer would support insulation above while forming the cabin's ceiling below. The planks were secured to ridgepoles with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. Over the plank ceiling, Embret created an insulation layer using the same treated hay sheaves he had used in the walls. He laid sheaves horizontally across the planks, packing them tightly together to create a continuous blanket 18 inches thick. The horizontal orientation worked for roof insulation because the planks below prevented compression. He covered the hay layer with birch bark sheets, overlapping them in shingle fashion so water would drain outward toward the roof edges. Over the birch bark, he applied a thick layer of clay mixed with grass, creating a waterproof seal that bound all the layers together. The clay application took several days, requiring multiple batches mixed to proper consistency and spread evenly across the entire roof surface. The clay dried slowly in winter cold, but eventually hardened into a continuous barrier. Finally, over the dried clay, Embret laid sod cut from the prairie, placing sections of grass and soil grass side up across the entire roof. The sod was laid in overlapping courses, starting at the lower roof edge and working upward, ensuring water would flow over the surface without penetrating between sod sections. The living grass would root into the clay layer, creating a permanent living roof that was waterproof, fireproof, and heavily insulated. The completed roof assembly was extraordinarily heavy, probably exceeding 1 ton total weight, but the robust wall construction supported it easily. The insulation thickness above the living space matched the wall insulation, creating a thermal envelope around the cabin's entire interior volume. The eaves extended beyond the outer walls, protecting the wall tops and insulation from direct rain. Embret built a small chimney through the roof for the stove, carefully sealing around it with clay to prevent leaks. The cabin was habitable by late January of 1870, with walls, roof, door, and window completed, though interior finishing work remained ongoing. Embret moved his family from the old cabin into the new structure during a period of moderate weather. The transition took 2 days of hauling furniture, supplies, and household goods across the short distance between buildings. Ranghild organized the interior, while Embret installed shelving and completed the sleeping loft. Tarjei explored every corner of the new space, fascinated by the thick walls and the strange golden color visible where hay showed through gaps in the interior log walls. The first serious cold arrived in early February. Temperatures dropped sharply overnight, falling to -20 degrees by dawn. The wind picked up, driving the effective temperature even lower. Embret woke before sunrise and checked his thermometers. Outside, air temperature read -22 degrees. Inside the cabin, near the stove that had burned low overnight, the temperature was 48 degrees. Away from the stove, in the corner farthest from heat source, the temperature was 32 degrees. The cabin interior was maintaining a 70-degree temperature difference from outside air with minimal fire. He rebuilt the fire to a moderate level, not the roaring blaze they had required in the old cabin. Within an hour, the interior temperature near the stove reached 65 degrees. The far corner warmed to 45 degrees. By midday, with outside temperatures still at -18, the cabin interior stabilized at 58 degrees, with a fire that consumed perhaps one-third the wood they had previously burned for inferior results. Ragnhild noticed the difference immediately. She could work comfortably throughout the cabin without staying near the stove. Tarjei played on the floor without needing multiple layers of clothing. The air felt still and warm rather than drafty and cold. There were no frost patterns on the interior walls. The water bucket near the door remained liquid rather than freezing solid. The temperature stability was remarkable. In the old cabin, moving 10 feet from the stove meant entering a dramatically colder zone. In the new cabin, temperature varied only moderately across the interior space. The insulation wasn't just keeping heat inside, it was distributing that heat more evenly throughout the living area. Embret measured and recorded temperatures every few hours throughout the day. The data confirmed what they felt experientially. The cabin maintained interior temperatures 50 to 55 degrees warmer than outside air with moderate fire. During the night, when the fire burned down to coals, the temperature dropped but remained above freezing even in the coldest corners. The thermal mass of the log walls helped, storing heat during the day and releasing it slowly overnight. But the insulation was the critical factor, preventing heat from escaping as quickly as it was lost in conventional construction. Siver stopped by that evening, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but clearly curious about how the new cabin was performing. He stepped inside and immediately noticed the warmth. The brutal cold wave struck in mid-February of 1870, pushing temperatures to levels rarely seen even on the Minnesota frontier. The first night dropped to -35 degrees. The second night reached -40. By the third night, Embret's outdoor thermometer registered -42 degrees, cold enough that metal tools left outside became brittle and breath froze instantly into ice crystals. The wind stopped completely during the coldest nights, creating an eerie silence across the frozen landscape. Smoke from cabin chimneys rose straight upward in the still air. Across the Norwegian settlement, families burned firewood at unsustainable rates, trying to maintain survivable interior temperatures. Siver Bjornstad's family went through their entire woodpile reserve in 5 days and had to begin burning furniture and fence posts to keep the fire going. In conventional cabins, interior temperatures dropped below freezing despite fires burning continuously. Water buckets froze solid within feet of stoves. Families slept in layers of clothing under piled furs and blankets, huddled together for warmth. Children and elderly people were at serious risk. The settlement lost 2 people during the cold wave, an elderly widow whose fire went out during the night, and an infant who couldn't maintain body temperature despite being wrapped and held constantly. Inside Embret's cabin, conditions were dramatically different. He maintained a moderate fire, burning perhaps 1 log every 2 hours. The interior temperature stabilized at 52 degrees, cool enough to require warm clothing, but far above freezing. Water remained liquid throughout the cabin. Ragnhild cooked normally on the stove. Tarjei slept comfortably in the loft without excessive coverings. The most striking difference was fuel consumption. Embret burned approximately 6 logs per day during the extreme cold. Siver, in a conventional cabin of similar size, burned 30 to 40 logs daily and still couldn't maintain adequate warmth. The insulation wasn't just improving comfort, it was preventing the fuel exhaustion that threatened other families' survival. Embret offered firewood to neighbors who had depleted their reserves, sharing from his stockpile that remained largely intact because his cabin required so little fuel. The gesture was appreciated but also highlighted the effectiveness of his construction method in ways that made some neighbors uncomfortable. Their skepticism was being proven wrong in the most public and measurable way possible. On the 4th night of extreme cold, Embret conducted a careful measurement comparison. He walked to Siver's cabin with his thermometers and recorded the interior temperature, 18 degrees near the stove, below zero in the corners, despite a massive fire consuming wood rapidly. He returned home and measured his own cabin. 54 degrees near the stove, 42 degrees in the coldest corner with a moderate fire. The difference was 52 degrees in the warmest areas, even more dramatic in the corners. The numbers were irrefutable. His hay-insulated cabin maintained interior temperatures more than 50 degrees warmer than outside air while burning a fraction of the fuel required by conventional construction. The extreme cold broke in late February, temperatures moderating to merely cold rather than dangerously frigid. As conditions improved and families recovered from the ordeal, the Norwegian settlement's attitude toward Embret's cabin shifted noticeably. The open mockery stopped. Neighbors who had joked about rotting hay and wasted effort now approached with genuine curiosity. The change happened gradually over several weeks, but was unmistakable. Gulbrand Ness was among the first to ask serious questions. He visited on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a community barn-raising plan for spring, but clearly interested in the cabin construction. He asked about the double-wall spacing, the hay treatment process, and the birch bark moisture barriers. His questions were technical and specific, the inquiries of a carpenter evaluating methodology rather than a skeptic looking for flaws. Embret answered every question completely, providing details about dimensions, materials, and techniques. He showed Gulbrand the wall assembly where interior logs were visible, explaining how the 36-inch gap was maintained during construction. He described the pine tar and animal fat mixture ratios, the wood-ash application timing, and the vertical hay sheaf orientation. Gulbrand took mental notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. He admitted the construction had proven more effective than he had anticipated. The fuel savings alone justified the additional labor and material costs. If the insulation remained stable through multiple seasons, the technique represented a genuine improvement over conventional methods. Other settlers followed Gulbrand's example, asking questions privately rather than publicly endorsing something they had previously ridiculed. Siver was slower to acknowledge the cabin's success, but eventually came around. His family had nearly depleted their firewood reserves during the cold wave and had suffered considerably more than Embret's family during the same period. The contrast was too obvious to ignore. He stopped by one evening in early March, asking bluntly how much the construction had cost in time and materials. Embret calculated honestly. Approximately 90 days of labor spread across 4 months, twice the logs of a standard cabin, significant hay harvest and treatment time, and specialized materials like birch bark and pine tar. The total investment was substantial, but the fuel savings were equally substantial. Siver asked whether Embret would help him build a similar cabin the following year. The request was admission that the technique worked. Reverend Kild addressed the topic obliquely during a Sunday service, speaking about wisdom coming from unexpected sources and the importance of remaining open to new ideas, even when they challenged conventional understanding. He didn't mention Embret by name, but everyone understood the reference. Ragnhild appreciated the acknowledgement, having endured months of sidelong glances and whispered comments about her husband's obsession. Jacob Pritchard spread word of the cabin beyond the Norwegian settlement, describing it to American farmers and settlers he encountered through his merchant business. The technique was beginning to gain recognition as something worth considering rather than dismissing. March brought thaw, and the critical test of whether Embret's hay insulation had survived winter without deteriorating. Moisture was the primary concern. Conventional wisdom held that organic materials packed into walls would absorb water vapor from interior air, especially in a dwelling where cooking, breathing, and daily activities generated constant humidity. The absorbed moisture would create conditions for rot, fungal growth, and structural failure. If the hay had rotted over winter, the entire elaborate construction would be revealed as a delayed failure rather than a genuine innovation. Neighbors waited to see what spring inspection would reveal. Siver mentioned several times that he expected the walls to be composting masses of decayed vegetation once opened. In late March, with weather mild enough for outdoor work, Embret deliberately opened a test section of the wall to allow inspection. He removed several outer wall logs near the door, creating an opening that exposed the hay insulation cavity. A small crowd gathered to observe, including Gulbrand, Siver, Reverend Kild, and several other families from the settlement. The interior of the wall cavity was clearly visible. The hay sheaves remained intact, their tar-coated surfaces showing no signs of deterioration. Embret pulled out one sheaf completely, laying it on the ground for examination. The outer tar coating was hard and stable. The wood ash dusting remained in place. He broke the sheaf open, revealing the interior hay stems. They were dry, brittle, and completely free of rot or mold. The birch bark moisture barriers were examined next. They remained flexible and showed no degradation. There was no water staining, no evidence of moisture penetration from the cabin interior into the insulation space. The tar coating had effectively sealed the hay against moisture absorption. The alkaline wood ash environment had prevented any fungal or bacterial growth. The system had worked exactly as Embret had designed it to work. Siver examined the hay closely, looking for any sign of decay. He found none. The insulation was in the same condition as when it had been installed 3 months earlier. Gulbrand asked about the long-term stability. Would the materials last 1 year, 5 years, or longer? Embret acknowledged uncertainty about extreme long-term performance, but pointed out that the treatment process was designed for durability. The pine tar was a preservative used on ship hulls and fence posts, materials expected to last decades. Reverend Kilda spoke publicly what others were thinking privately. Embret had been right, and the community had been wrong to mock his efforts. The hay insulation technique was effective and apparently durable. He apologized on behalf of the settlement for the skepticism and ridicule Embret had endured. Embret accepted the apology graciously, but without dwelling on past criticism. His goal had been keeping his family safe, not proving neighbors wrong. Spring of 1870 brought the first converts to Embret's construction method. Tolf Haugen announced in April that he would build a new cabin using hay insulation, replacing his existing structure that had proven dangerously inadequate during the winter cold wave. Tolf's family had suffered considerably during the extreme temperatures, burning through their entire firewood reserve and barely surviving the coldest nights. His decision to adopt Embret's technique was driven by necessity rather than curiosity. He couldn't face another winter in a cabin that couldn't maintain survivable temperatures without consuming impossible amounts of fuel. Embret agreed to help with the construction, sharing his knowledge freely and assisting with the most technically demanding aspects of the build. The construction process followed the same methodology Embret had developed. Double walls with 36-inch spacing, treated hay sheaves packed vertically with birch bark moisture barriers, and heavily insulated roof assembly. Tolf modified some details based on available materials and his own carpentry preferences, but the fundamental principles remained intact. The build took the entire summer, with Tolf working alongside Embret during the most complex phases. By September, Tolf had a completed cabin ready for winter testing. The structure looked nearly identical to Embret's, with the distinctive bulk of double-wall construction and the golden tint of hay visible in gaps. Neighbors who had watched both builds could see the technique being replicated and refined. Severin Moen, a Swedish settler who farmed land adjacent to the Norwegian community, began his own hay-insulated cabin in June. Severin had heard about Embret's construction through Jacob Pritchard and had visited to examine the finished building. He was impressed by the fuel savings and temperature stability. As a Swede living somewhat isolated from the Norwegian settlement's social dynamics, Severin had no prior investment in skepticism about the technique. He simply evaluated it as a practical solution to a shared problem and decided to implement it. His construction incorporated slight variations, using available Swedish carpentry techniques for some joinery details, but followed Embret's insulation principles closely. Gulbrand Ness, who had initially criticized the method as impractical, began recommending hay insulation to clients seeking his carpentry services. His endorsement carried significant weight in the community. If a respected builder acknowledged the technique's value, it gained legitimacy among settlers who might otherwise dismiss it as experimental foolishness. Goldbrand built his first hay-insulated structure in late summer, a cabin for a newly arrived family that had purchased land near the settlement. He consulted with Embret on treatment methodology and insulation installation, applying his considerable carpentry skill to refine construction efficiency. The project demonstrated that the technique could be implemented by competent builders beyond its original inventor. By autumn of 1870, 4 hay-insulated cabins existed in the area, each representing a test of the method's reproducibility and effectiveness. The upcoming winter would validate whether the technique worked consistently across different implementations or whether Embret's success had been partially due to unique factors specific to his particular build. The Norwegian settlement watched with interest as the new cabins prepared for their first cold season test. The winter of 1870 to 1871 provided data from multiple hay-insulated cabins, allowing comparison of different implementation approaches. Tollef's cabin performed nearly identically to Embret's original structure, maintaining interior temperatures 50 to 55 degrees above outside air with minimal fuel consumption. The replication validated that the technique was reproducible when core principles were followed carefully. Severin's cabin showed slightly less impressive results, maintaining 40 to 45 degree temperature differentials. Investigation revealed that Severin had used thinner hay sheaves and less pine tar in his treatment mixture, creating adequate but not optimal insulation performance. The comparison demonstrated that material quality and treatment thoroughness significantly affected outcomes. Goldbrand's client cabin performed exceptionally well, actually exceeding Embret's results slightly. Goldbrand had implemented several refinements based on his carpentry expertise. He had sealed the joints between inner wall logs more carefully, reducing air infiltration. He had extended the roof insulation thickness to 24 inches instead of 18, improving overhead thermal performance. His modifications showed that the basic technique could be improved through thoughtful refinement. The success of these first-generation adoptions encouraged additional settlers to consider hay insulation for new construction or major renovations. Several families began planning spring builds using the method. Experimentation with variations also began. Some builders tried different organic materials for insulation. Dried cattail leaves, which grew abundantly in local wetlands, were tested as an alternative to prairie hay. The cattail insulation worked, but proved more difficult to treat and pack effectively. Others experimented with alternative treatment mixtures, substituting available materials for pine tar or animal fat. A mixture using boiled linseed oil and beeswax showed promise, but was more expensive. These experiments created a growing body of practical knowledge about what worked well, what worked adequately, and what failed. The community began developing collective expertise around insulation techniques. Failures occurred alongside successes. A settler named Henrik Johansson built a hay-insulated cabin but skipped the tar treatment process, considering it too labor-intensive. He packed untreated hay directly into his wall cavities. By spring, the untreated hay had indeed rotted, creating exactly the problem skeptics had originally predicted. Henrik's failure reinforced the importance of proper material treatment. The tar coating wasn't optional decoration, it was essential preservation. Another builder used green hay harvested too early in the season. The high moisture content in the green hay caused problems despite tar treatment. The lesson was clear. Material selection and preparation mattered as much as construction technique. Embret observed these variations with interest, but without territorial protectiveness about his original design. He shared information freely with anyone who asked, explained what had worked for him, and helped troubleshoot problems when builders encountered difficulties. His attitude was that improving frontier housing benefited everyone. If modifications to his technique produced better results, that was positive regardless of who developed them. The collaborative approach accelerated refinement and spread knowledge throughout the broader settlement community. Word of the Norwegian hay-insulated cabins spread beyond the immediate settlement area during 1871. Jacob Pritchard played a significant role in this dissemination, describing the technique to customers and contacts across the Minnesota and Wisconsin territories during his merchant travels. He carried sketches of the wall assembly and could explain the basic principles to interested listeners. Several American farmers and settlers adopted versions of the method based on Pritchard's descriptions, adapting it to their own circumstances and available materials. The technique began appearing in communities that had no direct contact with Embret or the Norwegian settlement, transmitted through word-of-mouth networks that connected frontier communities. A newspaper correspondent visiting the area wrote an article about frontier building innovations for a street pall newspaper. The piece described several local adaptations to harsh climate, including sod houses, dugout shelters, and prominently featured the Norwegian hay insulation method. The article included basic technical details and quoted Embret about the physics principles behind the design. Publication in a territorial newspaper gave the technique broader visibility than it had previously enjoyed. Readers across Minnesota and neighboring territories learned about hay insulation as a viable construction approach. Some dismissed it as impractical or peculiar to Norwegian settlers, but others recognized the potential application to their own situations. The technique adapted to different climates and circumstances as it spread. In southern Minnesota, where winters were somewhat milder, builders used thinner insulation layers while maintaining the double wall principle. In northern Wisconsin, where cold was even more extreme, some builders increased insulation thickness beyond Embret's original 36 inches. Settlers in heavily forested areas used different outer wall materials, sometimes substituting milled lumber for logs when sawmills were available. The core concept remained consistent, creating a thick barrier of treated organic insulation between interior living space and exterior weather, but implementation details varied based on local conditions and resources. By 1872, hay insulation was no longer experimental or novel in frontier communities across the upper Midwest. It had become an established option among several accepted building approaches. Carpenters and builders included it in their repertoire of techniques. Land agents mentioned it when describing housing options to prospective settlers. The method had transitioned from individual innovation to regional building practice. Embret's name was sometimes associated with the technique in the Norwegian settlement and immediate area, but in more distant communities, it was simply known as hay insulation or double wall construction without specific attribution to any individual inventor. The broader adoption created economic effects. Settlers using hay insulation reported fuel savings of 60 to 70% compared to conventional cabins, significantly reducing the labor required for firewood cutting and hauling. The fuel savings were particularly valuable for families where labor was limited or where firewood was becoming scarce due to local deforestation. The 1870s saw hay insulation become standard practice in northern frontier settlements where extreme cold made conventional construction inadequate. The technique spread through immigrant communities first, particularly among Scandinavian settlers whose cultural background included traditions of heavy insulation in European buildings. Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish families adopted the method readily, recognizing similarities to old country construction approaches adapted for New World materials. But the technique also crossed ethnic boundaries as practical benefits became undeniable. American-born settlers, German immigrants, and other groups began implementing hay insulation when building in cold climates. The physics of heat retention didn't care about the builder's nationality or cultural background. Documentation of lives saved through better insulation was mostly indirect and anecdotal. Families surviving winters that previously would have been fatal rarely recorded their survival as newsworthy. But community records showed declining winter mortality rates in settlements where insulated construction became common. Fewer children died from cold-related illnesses. Fewer elderly people succumbed to hypothermia. Fewer families faced catastrophic firewood shortages that left them without adequate heat. The improvements were gradual and distributed across many households, making them difficult to attribute to any single cause. But the correlation between insulated housing and improved winter survival was observable to those paying attention. Fuel consumption data provided more concrete evidence of impact. Settlements tracked firewood usage through various mechanisms, and the statistics showed clear trends. Communities with widespread adoption of hay insulation consumed 40 to 50% less firewood per household than comparable communities using conventional construction. The reduction freed up significant labor time previously spent cutting, hauling, and processing wood. That labor could be redirected to agricultural improvement, craft production, or other economically productive activities. The insulation technique generated compounding benefits beyond simple comfort and survival. The economic advantages drove continued adoption through the 1880s and into the 1890s. As frontier regions became more settled and firewood became scarcer due to local deforestation, fuel efficiency became increasingly valuable. Hay insulation provided a way to maintain comfortable living conditions while reducing dependence on diminishing wood supplies. In some areas, the technique enabled settlement in locations that would have been uninhabitable using conventional construction methods. The ability to maintain warm interiors with minimal fuel allowed families to establish farms and homesteads in extremely cold regions where fuel wood was limited. Variations and improvements continued to emerge. Builders experimented with different insulation materials, including dried moss, shredded bark, wool batting, and eventually commercially produced materials as they became available. But hay remained popular because it was locally available, renewable, and effective when properly treated and installed. The fundamental principles Embret had established, double wall construction with thick insulation and moisture barriers, persisted across all variations. By the 1890s, the technique had influenced professional architectural practice. Buildings in cold regions were being designed with insulation cavities and thermal performance considerations that traced their lineage back to frontier innovations like Embret's hay-insulated cabin. The knowledge had moved from individual solution to regional practice to established building science. Embret Lunde died in April of 1892 at age 68. He had lived in the hay-insulated cabin he built for 22 years, the structure remaining sound and functional throughout that period. The insulation showed no significant deterioration. The treated hay maintained its structural integrity and thermal performance. The birch bark moisture barriers remained effective. The cabin had required minimal maintenance beyond normal upkeep of doors, windows, and roof surface. Ranghild and Tarjei still occupied the cabin, comfortable and warm through every winter. Embret's death was unremarkable by frontier standards. He simply grew old, his body wearing out after decades of hard physical labor in a demanding climate. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning when the prairie was beginning to green and the first migrating birds were returning. The funeral was attended by the Norwegian settlement community and neighbors from surrounding farms. Reverend Kild, now elderly himself, led the service and spoke about Embret's quiet determination and practical wisdom. He mentioned the cabin, acknowledging that Embret's innovation had influenced how an entire region built shelter against winter. But the eulogy focused more on Embret as a husband, father, and community member than as an inventor or innovator. That was appropriate. Embret had never sought recognition for the insulation technique. He had developed it to protect his family after tragedy. Sharing it with others had been generous practicality, not ambition for credit or fame. He was buried next to Gunhild on the hillside overlooking his land, the grave marked with a simple stone that listed his name and dates with no mention of his contributions to frontier building methods. Tarjei, now a man of 29 with his own family, inherited the cabin and the farm. He continued living in the structure his father had built, raising his children in the warmth and safety that had been purchased through grief and obsessive innovation 2 decades earlier. The cabin would remain occupied by Lunde descendants for another 30 years before eventually being abandoned when the family moved to town. By then, hundreds of similar structures existed across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. Some were still called Norwegian hay houses in local parlance. Most were simply homes, their construction method unremarkable because it had become common. Modern historians studying frontier architecture would eventually rediscover the hay insulation technique through examination of surviving structures and period documentation. They would recognize it as a significant innovation in cold climate building, an example of practical engineering emerging from necessity on the American frontier. But they would struggle to identify specific inventors or trace the technique's origins to individual creators. The knowledge had spread organically, adapted by many hands, and become collective wisdom rather than attributed invention. Embret's name appeared in some local records and family histories, but his role as originator was largely forgotten outside the Norwegian settlement's oral traditions. Across the northern frontier, cabins built with hay insulation continued standing and functioning long after their builders died. The structures served new families, sheltering generations who never knew the technique had once been controversial or experimental. The innovation had become invisible through success, so completely integrated into standard practice that it no longer seemed innovative. That quiet disappearance into ordinary competence was perhaps the highest validation of Embret's work. He had solved a problem so well that the solution stopped being remarkable and simply became the way things were done.